Hi, everyone. This is Sunoikisis session number 8. Oof, tongue twist, excuse me. So I would ask you to go ahead and start introducing yourself in the chat, and please join us in the chat. I'm Andrea Wallace. I'm at the University of Exeter, senior lecturer in law. And please remember that you can engage at any point during the video and during the session. Because we're going to be collecting questions and also thinking about how those relate to each other at the end during our discussion. Also, a hello to anyone in the future who may be watching this at a later date. We're really glad that you could join us. So today we are going to be joined by Mathilde Pavis and Douglas McCarthy, and of course, Gabby, to discuss intellectual property, open access, and heritage institution. We're going to be looking at some of the issues around restitution and repatriation, but actually thinking instead of so much the material object, the digital questions, especially as regards to open access and how we engage with cultural heritage that is acquired during positions of colonization or forced occupation. So we're going to be thinking about how open access and even reuse of digital reproductions and research around these collections, how it's stewarded, how it is shared, and potentially who even owns it, raises new questions that are related to power and narratives and control. But we're also going to be thinking about how open access can enable new research with restitution and repatriation goals. So I'm going to ask Douglas, of course, and Mathilde to present on the topics of these issues today. And then we're going to wrap up with a little bit of a case study, thinking about the Nefertiti Hack and how that relates to restitution, but also digitization, and even Cosmo Wenman's efforts to get the museum to release the data and some of the really interesting questions and engagement and how that relates to both Mathilde and Doug's presentations. So let me introduce the speakers who we are so pleased to have with us today. Douglas McCarthy is collections engagement manager at the Europeana Foundation. He's an Open Glam advocate, and he leads on the development of our Open Glam survey, which he'll talk about today. And it collects policy and practice of open access instances around the world. He also writes and presents on this topic extensively, so you may recognize him from some of his many appearances in different Open Glam and open access and open data discussions. And we also have Mathilde Pavis, who is a senior lecturer in law at the University of Exeter with me, and a researcher in the Center for Science, Culture, and the Law at Exeter, or as we refer to it as Schoolie. So her research focuses on intellectual property rights and cultural heritage management, particularly focusing on intangible cultural heritage and performers' rights. And more recently, she's been looking at the issues of deepfakes in the law, which has been fascinating. So I will go ahead and let Doug take it over. And he's going to start us off today with his presentation. So go right ahead, Doug. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea, for the nice introduction. And hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining now or in the future, as Andrea said. Absolutely delighted to join this session today. And today I'm going to talk about Open Glam. I'm going to present a brief introduction, really, to the Open Glam universe, for those of you who may be less familiar with it than others. And I've called my talk today New Horizons in Open Glam. Because what I want to suggest over the next 15 minutes or so is really that Open Glam is shifting from a purely copyright licensing and intellectual property focused discussion and community to some interesting new dimensions, and there's some really excellent work going on right now. So I'll be sharing some examples over the next few minutes. Also to say, in terms of housekeeping, that I will be sharing a link to these slides, and of course they'll be documented by Gabby in the GitHub and linked in YouTube, I'm sure. So you'll have full access to everything that I present today if you want to do further reading and check out some of the resources that we will see together. So let's get underway. New Horizons in Open Glam. Yes, now. So here is our agenda for the next few minutes. To help frame the discussion that we will have with Mathilde and Andrea and everyone later, I want to talk about Open Glam to give us some context of repatriation discussions around digital heritage, open access and restitution. So we'll look at Open Glam. I'll have a brief introduction. I will present the latest global data, things that we know about this world. I'll be sharing some useful resources and examples with you and highlight some of the challenges and opportunities in this space. So Glam, we use it every day. I use it many times a day, but if you're not familiar with it, it stands for galleries, libraries, archives and museums, and it's a useful shorthand really for the cultural heritage world. So the plus here indicates that it's not only about these 4 types of institutions. It also includes other kinds of archives, other kind of collecting institutions and so on. So Open Glam. Well, firstly, a really useful key principle in this world is that reproductions of public domain works should remain in the public domain when digitized. Within the European Union, the important principle and sort of threshold of copyright law is authors' own intellectual creation. So that's a handy rubric. It's a good thing to remember when we're thinking about what is worthy of new copyright when objects, and particularly public domain collections, are digitized. And Open Glam is also a vibrant global community of people, often volunteers, and organizations who are working hard and have been for years to open up content and data held within and by memory institutions where culturally appropriate. I put that in bold because that's particularly relevant to this session today. This is a slide from our friend and colleague Brigitte Vetsina from Creative Commons, I think from session 5 of this series. And I've just put it up to just remind us all that when we talk about copyright and licensing in the Open Glam space, we should also recognize that copyright itself has a very kind of sometimes odd, slightly uneasy intersection with traditional cultural expressions, indigenous cultural values, interests, and rights. Looking at licensing and copyright in Open Glam, the open definition, which was developed by Open Knowledge International several years ago, can be summed up in the following phrase, which is on screen. Open means that anyone can freely access, use, modify, and share for any purpose. This is a really helpful and a widely accepted definition of what open means in the Glam space. And to show you some of the most common legal tools and licenses in Open Glam, I put them up on screen here. We have the public domain mark, we have the CC0 copyright waiver, the attribution, CC BY license, also CC BY SA, which is attribution and share alike. And then there is no known copyright, which is an asterisk here indicating that there are a few different varieties of this. For example, the Flickr Commons no known copyright statement, and also the no known copyright from rightstatements.org. So there are also equivalents here, and when we look at the global picture of Open Glam, there are national equivalent domestic licenses, which are roughly equivalent to the ones that you see here. Always worth noting that non-commercial NC and no derivative ND license flavors and similar terms and conditions based restrictions are not considered Open Glam within this community because they're too restrictive. They limit too much their reuse of the content which has been licensed this way. So that's worth remembering. As Andrea alluded to in her introduction, for 3 years now, she and I have been surveying Open Glam. The Open Glam survey, which is linked and is shown on screen here, is at its heart a gigantic spreadsheet which examines and records how Glams make open access data, whether that is digital objects, metadata, text, other digital media types, available for reuse. And it's the 3rd birthday of the survey this week, so happy birthday. The survey lists in quite a lot of detail many different data points. The key ones are on screen here. So we have institution name, of course, the country, and the type of Glam. Is it a university-based collection? Is it within perhaps a corporate institution? Is it an archive? That's all modeled in the survey. As you'd expect, the licenses and rights statements for the digital surrogates and the metadata are both recorded whenever that information is available. And the survey also provides direct links to terms of use, copyright policies, and similar documentation around access from the institutions. Usefully, the survey also now has direct links to almost 50 million digital objects from just under 1,000 institutions. So you can use the survey, if you wish to, as a gateway, as a portal into an amazing array of openly licensed data from Glam institutions. I'm also pleased to say that the survey is annotated and recorded in detail in Wikidata. The QID is on screen here. And worth noting for today's session that in the second half of last year, Andrea and I introduced a new data point which we started capturing in the survey, and that's around whether a policy exists for intangible cultural heritage and traditional cultural expressions. So that's begun, but it's still a work in progress. How do we collect the information in the survey? What's the scope of it? Well, the data that Glams make available on their websites and other external platforms, for example, aggregators, open data platforms, Flickr Commons, I mentioned already. The focus is on digital surrogates of objects in the public domain, where any term of copyright for the material object has expired or actually never existed in the first place. And the information is gathered by desk research and outreach to the global Glam community who've been absolutely intrinsic. Excuse me, sorry, I just lost my place there. One moment. Yep, sorry, there we are. So yeah, the global Glam community who share links to data with us, let us know when new open data policies are developed, are incredibly helpful. We couldn't do it without them. If you want to know a little bit more in depth about the survey, I've written 3 introductory articles. Now they've been translated into 6 or 7 languages, and these are available on Open Glam Medium. Again, it's linked here. Where can you access Open Glam data? Well, here are some of the major portals. There are many, many more. Wikimedia Commons, of course, is a key one. Cultural heritage aggregators like Europeana, Japan Search, Trove, and Digital New Zealand are also extremely useful places to go and find this data. Creative Commons Search, Sketchfab, particularly for 3D collections, licensed under CC0, is growing. I think it just had its first birthday too. And also there are websites connected with open data portals, like the one here in Switzerland, or the German regional hackathon series, Coding Da Vinci. So Open Glam today, this is a map generated from Wikidata, from the survey information. As you can immediately see here on screen, and I hope you can see it clear enough, that the red dots here are instances of open access that we have uncovered so far. And there is a clear, obvious clustering in Europe, particularly the eastern seaboard of the United States, and also in New Zealand and Australia. So the coverage of open access in Open Glam around the world is still very much a Anglosphere, a particularly kind of European and American-based phenomenon. If we look at the regional maps in a little bit more detail, here you can see Africa and the Middle East, Asia and Australasia. There are not so many red dots. This is Open Glam in the Americas. We have uncovered quite a number of instances in Latin America, but relative to North America, it is still far fewer. Open Glam in Europe, as mentioned, is a very strong clustering, and we'll talk about why that is in a moment. So in the Open Glam world, what are the challenges in this space? Well, I've got a few here to share with you. The first one is that open access is very much a reflection and mirroring of socio-economic, technical, human infrastructures and resources. For example, in the survey and in the maps that we just looked at, you can see a distortion effect where there have been funded for several years, aggregators like Europeana and the German Digital Library, they have clustered, multiplied and produced a huge amount of data. For example, Europeana has over 50 million digital objects and has been around for just over 10 years. But where aggregators haven't been funded and don't exist in regions and countries in other parts of the world, then as a consequence, the data, and particularly the open data, is far less visible and it's certainly much harder to find. As mentioned earlier, the Western-focused legacy in history and culture of copyright really isn't applicable to many other parts of the world. And the complexity of copyright and intellectual property law presents a really high barrier to entry for non-specialists. For institutions themselves, there is, particularly in the COVID pandemic, increasing pressure to generate money, generate revenue from Glam assets, for example, photographs, digital surrogates of paintings, artworks, other types of collections. And never underestimate the power of the status quo. Glams are often relatively conservative institutions which are slow moving, so change can take a long time to happen. And there is also, as collecting authorities, as they see themselves, a strong control reflex and habit in the Glam space. And sometimes we slightly jokingly refer to this as an open Glam. And let's have a quick look at one example. So this is the famous Finney wedding portrait by Jan van Eyck. It was painted in 1432, not very far from where I'm speaking to you, across in Flanders. And this is in the National Gallery collection in London. This is the website which is on screen, and it's offering me a low resolution image, that's 800 pixels on the longest side. And it's presented under a non-commercial and no derivative, so very closed, certainly a non-open license. And as you can see here, photo copyright the National Gallery in London. So the conservatism and the kind of closed approach to digital collections, even one like this, which in most senses would be seen to be in the public domain, this power of the status quo is very strong. And for many users, such as Kento, the shocked monkey, and myself here, this is really surprising to find that even something which is almost 700 years ago that was created is still claimed to be in copyright and hard to access and reuse without paying. In the European Union, there is important copyright reform underway with the CDSM, the Copyright in the Digital Single Market Directive, particularly Article 14, which really reinforces the current law that things which are in the public domain when digitized should remain so. And that's due for transposition into the member states' national laws by June, 7th of June this year. So this is very much a watching brief. Let's see what happens. Will this mean that for relevant works that CC by say licenses for public domain works will cease to be used, or will it take a little bit longer? If you want to catch up and see what the picture is around cultural heritage, the public domain in this context, then I massively recommend this brilliant paper by Andrea and Professor Ellen Euler from the University of Potsdam, which came out last summer, linked here again. Yeah, and Barney and Mo explain here that gatekeeping of public domain data, or NOPAN GLAM, although Article 14 of the directive promises reform and more open access, it is a little bit more complicated, and Andrea and Ellen's paper really explains that in great detail. There are some loopholes, and the Open Data Directive may present some other opportunities for institutions that don't want to open up. So, in my last section, I want to spend a couple of minutes talking about new directions and positive horizons for Open GLAM. There is a number of critical approaches to IP copyright and licensing. in relation to the preservation, management and dissemination of intangible cultural heritage and traditional cultural expressions. Centering the needs and desires of local communities away from the Western collecting memory institutions and their traditions, their perspectives, is something which is gradually happening and very, very welcome. Raising awareness in the public and in the Glam community of the complex issues here is also something which is, I think, is growing and very important. Sharing approaches and experiences, so case studies, for example, on the Open Glam Medium publication is something which we've seen grow, particularly in the last 2 years. And that there are great examples now of pioneering transparent, open and inclusive ways to access information and to take new approaches to restitution data. This is an article that came out on Open Glam Medium just last week, written by the Kenyan digital heritage specialist Che Tayana, and it introduces the Open Restitution Africa, which is an Africa-led project around opening up access, using open data platforms to present and share information about African material culture and empowering smarter and stakeholder-led community decisions. So really very, very interesting, important work. This is Auckland Museum. This is a cultural permissions apply notification that you get on their collection site, indicating that images of Maori and Pacific objects are available for personal research and private study only, even though under the kind of Western copyright perspective, you would say that they are in the public domain. So this is more mindful, I think, sensitive practice around open access. And this is Trove, the Australian cultural heritage aggregator. This, when you go to the homepage, is one of the first things that you see. It's making you aware, particularly for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander audiences, that the archive contains sensitive information. And it's not just in the digital space. This is an Australian Museums and Galleries publication from a couple of years ago about enhancing engagement with Indigenous communities in museums and galleries, so analog and digital. And my last example here is from Digitization in British Columbia. And this is a collaborative initiative around information management, sharing between Indigenous communities and a number of organizations. So again, very interesting, important work that we can learn from. And a lot of this is summed up in this website towards a declaration on open access for cultural heritage, which Andrea particularly has led on, been heavily involved in. And this presents, if you like, a really excellent summary of where we've come from, where we're going, and a number of new focus areas, which I put on screen here, are listed within. So a great resource to check out after this session. So thank you very much for listening to me today. Great to be with you, and very much look forward to your questions, either now or later on in this session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Doug. That actually was like a very perfect narrative and transition to take us into Mathilde for thinking about the approach, which is, of course, now part of the EU Commission's open by default, closed by exception sort of approach to thinking about the nuance of some of these questions, which now is going to take us directly into some of the things that Mathilde will be discussing. So Mathilde, I'll hand it over to you. You're going to need to unmute, Mathilde. Thank you.
There we are, unmuted. Well, thank you for the introduction. And actually, Doug's presentation is the perfect introduction to this, my presentation. So let me show up my first slide here. So what I'm going to talk about today is intellectual property rights, and that speaks to open access for the reasons that Doug has just explained, but in a context of a very specific debate or movement or effort, you might say, which is the restitution of cultural heritage. And I assume, and I know actually that you all know about that debate broadly because it's hit the news in the recent years, and that's been a movement ongoing for many, many years and decades. Before I start, it may seem odd to think about restitution of digital cultural heritage, especially or of cultural heritage, especially in the context of appropriated cultural heritage through colonization or invasions of territories or occupation in the centuries of engagement we've had. And that is restitution and digitization and intellectual property rights. Discussions, debates, and efforts on restitution and the repatriation of cultural heritage are old. But the discussion of intellectual property rights and actually digitization in the context of restitution and repatriation are actually relatively new. And it maybe comes across as a little bit unusual to put in together restitution, digitization, and intellectual property. But the issues of intellectual property and digitization, when we're talking about genuinely and comprehensively restituting cultural heritage, is essential. And that's because today, digital cultural heritage, it goes hand in hand with cultural heritage or material cultural heritage. And that's because the digitization, the digitalization, and the open access movements that we're seeing happening in the heritage sector are mediating and very much curating the way we engage with cultural heritage. And as we talk about the restitution of cultural heritage, we talk about the restitution of material cultural heritage primarily, but today, because we engage with cultural heritage so much more from a platform of online and digital, we cannot have this conversation without having a discussion about the restitution of digital cultural heritage. And when we talk about restituting digital cultural heritage, we cannot have this conversation without having a conversation of intellectual property rights. And that's because if we pull the thread, cultural heritage now cannot go without digital cultural heritage. Digital cultural heritage cannot go without and is in large part defined by intellectual property rights and open access. So this is how all of these pieces fit together. And my aim for this session today and for this presentation is to convince you that if you talk about restitution, you must also talk about the restitution of the digital cultural heritage. And that means having conversation with intellectual property rights and about open access at the same time. So that's my goal, and let's see if I can convince you today. So what I want to start with is the starting point that had Andrea and myself look at the restitution of digital cultural heritage. And for us, that happened when the French report, known as the Sasebo Report, was published last year in November 2000, not last year anymore, in November 2018. And that report was commissioned by the French government to look into developing a restitution strategy for France in order to return African cultural heritage to the communities of origin. Now, of course, this report is only one of the recent-ish effort or points of debate on that broader discussion and that very important process. But it is what was interesting in that is its sort of comment or recommendation about digitization and open access that I will go into in a minute. What I want to start with here is say a little bit more about the report itself, because a lot of our sort of comment on this topic is happened in response to it and has been shaped by what the report contained. So the Sasebo Report is named like that because of the authors, Felvin Sa and Bénédicte Savoie. And I'm using here, of course, the English pronunciations of those names. The Sasebo Report made recommendations about how restitution might proceed in France in order to see works of African cultural heritage returned to their communities of origins. And the Sasebo Report actually, at the time that it was published, caused quite a lot of governments and institutions outside France to reevaluate their practice. And not so much happens immediately in France. However, I'm happy to say that towards the end of last year, and although it's only a very timid step in that direction, but the French government passed a legislation to return 27 objects to Benin and Senegal. For some, that's too small and a little bit too late. For others, it's a step in the right direction. It is a small step, but at least the report didn't go completely unnoticed by the French government. What was great about that report is that it did spark or re-energized conversations on that topic outside France as well as within France. So let's look at this report. Now you can see here the first page, and it's not intended for you to necessarily read from it, but that's what you see if you open it. The purpose of that report is twofold. The first objective, and I guess the first half of the report, is dedicated to laying out the history and the responsibility of France to exploited African cultures, and really explaining why it's important that restitution happens and why it's morally, ethically, and legitimate as a process and effort, and why it's important and critical that it should happen, and happen really without restrictions and limitations. And the second part of the report, and perhaps the most interesting from a practice point of view, is that it outlines the challenges, but also a plan in order to see through the physical restitution of those objects. And it's talking through and covering various administrative processes and proposing, thoughts and recommendations on reparations, and it's really trying to take a practical view at the process of restitution as opposed to just positioning themselves as a political manifesto. And that was really concrete and practical, and something that we could then work on and build upon, which is what we did from the perspective of intellectual property and digital cultural heritage. And that is something that was covered in the report. You can see here an extract of the report that comes towards the end, where the authors are outlining the recommendations. And here you see that actually the report makes one particular recommendation regarding the sharing of digital content. Now, in the English version, you will see that text on page 67 and 68 of the report. And there are two recommendations within that paragraph that I'm going to go into more detail because they're relevant to open access, just introduced by Doug, but also intellectual property and how we think about that ethically in a lot of nuance when it is thought through in the context of restitution. The report recommends that for works of African cultural heritage held in France that have been digitized by French institutions, that a radical practice of sharing, including how one rethinks the politics of image use, be put in place by the French government. So that is their recommendation for works that have already been digitally reproduced or digitized by French institutions. They also recommend that those digital reproductions or any digital reproductions associated with African cultural heritage held in France and designated for restitution be put together and shared through a single open access portal. And that portal will also include any archival and documentation information and materials associated with those objects. Now, for works that haven't been digitized, and works here refer to objects of African cultural heritage held in France, the authors of the report recommend that a systematic digitization of documents not yet digitized be put in place. So they're asking the French government to digitize as they restitute or before they restitute. Or at least this is how we've interpreted it, and definitely, certainly how it reads. So we have two recommendations here, and I'm going to start talking about the implications for the first recommendations in the context of intellectual property and in the context of the state of Open Glam today, and see how that pairs up with the general idea or objective of unfettered, complete, comprehensive restitution of African cultural heritage, which is the aim and the objective of the report, and generally the objective of any restitution efforts or campaigns. Well, that is a recommendation. The authors advocate for a radical practice of sharing, including how one thinks about the politics of image rights use. These are different words to describe open access that has just been defined for us by Doug. And open access is the movement that scholars and practitioners have been calling for and advocating largely in the Western world or in the global North, as brilliantly illustrated by Doug just now. And this is what we understand the authors to recommend, and this is how this recommendation is reading. Now, this is coming from a good place where we value open access, and we think that ultimately open access leads to shared information, shared knowledge, and is largely positive. What the authors are asking is that open access apply to any digital reproductions of African cultural heritage currently held in France as part of this restitution process. And the problem we have with this recommendation is that it creates a double standard. If the government goes ahead and apply and implements this recommendation, it puts us in a bizarre position of obliging or recommending or imposing complete open access, or at least a form of open access, on digital reproductions of African cultural heritage without imposing or expecting the same obligation or the same standards of open access to French institutions in relation to French/national cultural heritage. Do you see the double standard I'm trying to tease out and draw out? And actually, to illustrate that and to show you why the double standard is such, the survey, Doug's and Andrea's survey of Open Glam is really helpful, because if you go and look at it, and if you look up French institution in that, you'll see that actually only 15 of the French cultural institutions are engaging in open access practice and policy for their collections. And within that, actually only 9 of those are going full open access for all of their collections, as opposed to going open access on a collection by collection basis. And actually you'd find that you'd need to go a little bit deeper and look at the type of data and the quality of data that's been released in open access to get a real full picture. But what I'm trying to get at is actually a really small portion of French cultural institutions are releasing French cultural heritage or national cultural heritage under an open access policy. So if we come in and ask the government to release everything that has to do with the African cultural heritage to be restituted to the communities of origins or their communities of origins, to go open access, we end up having this double standard where we're asking more of African cultural heritage in terms of access than we're asking or expecting of French national heritage. So there needs to be a little bit more joined up thinking here, as sort of when we're thinking about recommendations and implementations around digitization and open access. And this is not to suggest that open access is not a welcome and a positive beneficial development and sort of movement for the field, is that we need nuance in that, and we need to pay extra attention to who are making those decisions. Now, I'm going to give you an example of one of the leading French cultural institutions, not in open access, but leading in terms of the volume of collections that they hold that belong to or could fit in the category of African cultural heritage. The Musée du Quai Branly holds over 70,000 objects from sub-Saharan African countries, and 2/3 of the African objects designated in the report as potentially eligible for restitution held in France or in that museum. And that museum holds an impressive collections of digital reproductions of those objects, and actually it counts over 1 million images and reproductions of those objects. And you can see a snapshot here. And what's interesting here is that they do not practice open access. If you look at the terms and conditions, and that's also what shows up in the survey, is that they claim copyright in everything. They claim copyright in all of the digital reproductions of African cultural heritage. So they're not currently open access, and that's what the report is asking that be released. But what I want to draw your attention to is the fact that there are also politics involved. And there's a sort of very political and symbolic layer in the museum claiming copyright over the digital reproduction of this object, because they control going forward who gets to engage with that image. They get to control and say, authorize any economic benefits or amounts of commercializations or engagement that goes with that image of an object that is essentially separated from the communities of origins that it belongs to. So the claim to intellectual property rights that is attached or made to the digital reproduction of the object has the capacity to exclude others, including the community of origin, from accessing and engaging with that digital collection, that object, and any knowledge that it encapsulates or embeds. And that's this particular aspect of intellectual property that we advocate and argue should be embedded in any efforts of restitution. And here you have an example of, another entry where here clearly you could see the credits, who ends up being credited because of the dynamics and politics associated with copyright and moral rights. All the museums, the photographer that took the image, nothing here is said, or very little here is said about the actual communities of origin. And that's the sort of layers that copyright, when attached to digital reproductions, end up carrying around the object. ends up modifying the way in which we see, perceive, engage with, use, access the object. In other words, copyright and digitization are key to the curation and the management of those objects. And as such, that should be part of the restitution conversation. That should be part of the restitution package, that when we are kind of opening up that debate and considering embarking on that process. Now, let's turn to the second recommendation of the report on the question of the digital content associated with those collections. And if this is feeling a little bit fast and this is feeling a little bit too much, don't worry, I'll point you to a resource at the end of this presentation where you will be able to go over and reread any parts and find out more about copyright, find out more about moral rights in the context of restitution. So the second recommendation had to do with works or objects of African cultural heritage that are not digitized today, but should be as part of the restitution process, according to the authors of the report. And at the moment, those objects are held by French institutions, and the report advocates that digitization should happen in dialogue between the home or host institution and the communities of origins or other stakeholders. But we can assume from the way it's worded that it may happen in France and therefore under French copyright rules or any other sort of intellectual property rights and legislation that may apply. The report recommends that we digitize systematically the documents and the objects that haven't been digitized yet before they get repatriated or restituted to their communities of origin. And because that's likely to happen in France or within European countries, depending on where the object is, it's likely to then generate intellectual property rights and copyright in that country. And who gets to control and own and receive that intellectual property is also largely going to be decided according to French concepts and French laws around ownership and authorship of the objects. And you start seeing how here we're creating a little bit, again, more agency in the hands of the host institution in the context of a project that's about relegating and delegating all of that power, decision-making and agency back to the communities of origin. So I hope I'm kind of painting that picture of intellectual property being something that arises on the home institution's rules, even though we're in a process that's all about the communities of origin. So we really need to think critically about this process of digitization and all of the rights that it may generate, because, as I said, the digital reproductions will be an essential part of the way in which we'll engage with the object or we'll engage with those collections. And because both the digital reproduction and the way it's managed and the rights that may go with it or not are an essential part in how we engage with the object, how we use it, reuse it, remix it, or not, if it's not appropriate, then digitizing and claiming intellectual property or managing intellectual property as an open access in the context of an open access policy or a closed access policy is a curatorial decision. So it has to be something that is decided by the communities of origin. And as such, we really have to start thinking about digitization as a non-neutral process because of the rights it creates, but also because as an act or as a process, it's a curatorial act. And here, this is a piece that actually Andrea made me discover. That's an article by Andrew Prescott and Lorna Hughes that really called for slow digitization. Think about why you digitize and whether you need to digitize, because digitizing is not neutral. It may come natural to us, in the Western world, and that even itself is a huge sort of oversimplification and massive label, but it may seem as non-problematic, even beneficial to digitize, but it may be that it's not the case, that other communities have different beliefs and want to handle and care for their objects in a very different way. And the same, we argue, applies to open access, and the same, we argue, applies to intellectual property rights generally. And open access, digitization, intellectual property rights will have an impact on how this happens. And if someone doesn't want to digitize, that's fine. If a community of origin doesn't want to digitize, does not want to see any of their content digital otherwise being available on open access, that's fine. It is part of their prerogative to make that decision. Very much like the counter argument to restitution that we often hear, such as, oh, but if we return the objects, it might get stolen. If we return the objects, it might disappear. It might, there may not be the knowledge, the care, or the capacity to look after them in the way we do here, etc., etc. They may want to destroy things if we return them. Well, so be it. Those are their objects, and we advocate for that logic of these are their objects. They decide that this logic be applied to digitizing, managing the intellectual property rights if they occur at all, and open access. So I want to kind of leave you with some concluding thoughts on this. Here are three things I want you to think about. Number one is, why are we missing when we're rushing to digitize? Should we stop and reflect and think and consider, do we need to digitize? Who should make that decision? And what happens with the outputs and sort of the results of that digitization, both in terms of file and how we maintain this, etc., but also in terms of the intellectual property rights that might be generated in that process or not. Digital cannot be treated as an afterthought in the context of restitution or repatriation. Digital cultural heritage is an integral part of cultural heritage altogether. And digital cultural heritage needs to be part of that restitution process. If you're thinking cultural heritage, you have to think digital cultural heritage. And if you're thinking digital cultural heritage, you have to think intellectual property right and open access or closed access / access altogether. Finally, could we think about more equitable ways in which we digitize, we engage with open access, and consider knowledge generation and the implications for that, for the reasons I've just mentioned? But obviously, the dynamics and the politics involved in decolonization, restitution, repatriation are only one part of a much more ethically minded, nuanced approach to those questions. And there are many more. And I very much invite you to look at the new declaration for Open Glam that Doug has signposted and sort of highlighted in his presentation, because you'll see there various areas of focus that do speak to that more nuanced approach to open access, in which decolonizing and restituting fits in, but is only a part of. And here are the resources, or at least the resource that I kind of want to point you to. If you wanted to find out more about the dynamics between copyright and restitution or repatriation in the context of decolonization, this is this document that Andrea and I wrote in response to the Sasebo Report, explaining what I've described here briefly and going into detail about the law, if that's something that's of interest. And that's it. I wanted to leave you with that, and I hope I've convinced you that if you think cultural heritage, you have to think digital. If you think digital, you have to think IP and open access in the context of restitution.
Thank you so much, Mathilde. Let's see. I'm gonna actually build straight off of that and move into something that's a case study that we're going to use to discuss quickly, but that really does tie into this idea of whatever's happening and where it's happening, and the politics of that are so important to our perception of the work, the narratives that flow from that activity, and the control, especially legal control around access to the work. So something that I'm sure you've heard about, and if you haven't, don't worry, but just has kind of like blown my mind in about 42 different ways, is this case study that is called sometimes the Nefertiti Hack, or referred to as the other Nefertiti. And it is an art activist kind of approach from Jan Nicolai Nellis and Nora El-Badri, who visited the Neues Museum in Berlin, where the bust of Nefertiti is located. And what's really interesting about this are the very various layers and kind of the different things that we can pull from this activity. So I want to start by saying, of course, we have a couple of things to think about here. One is property law and one is intellectual property law. So it's both property in terms of the ownership of the work, but even the literal property in the land, and the fact that by entering the museum, there is a license that's extended to you that says this is basically a contract and here's how you can act within the institution. And should you exceed that contract, we have the right to remove you. So there is also an access parameter there that most often relates to the visitor photography policy, which becomes important, as you'll see. So with the Nefertiti bust, of course, I think personal photography is permitted throughout the museum, but just outside of the gallery where the bust sits is this sign that says photography is not permitted. And you'll see that Nefertiti is actually in a glass case. So what the artists did is they visited the museum with Nora El-Badri was wearing this Kinect camera, which of course is the camera that's hooked up to like a Microsoft system that if you're playing the game Just Dance or some of these other things, it will actually detect your body movements and kind of record that. So it was connected to a pack that was on her back that provided the power source. And what she did is she entered the gallery and by adjusting her scarf just ever so slightly, was able to circle the bust of the Nefertiti and scan it. Now we have these images because Johann Nikolai Nellis was actually filming this. And if you watch the video, which is available online, at one point you'll hear the guard who's in the room say, "No photos, please." So again, keep this in mind in terms of here's the Nefertiti and here's the gallery because it becomes really important. What they did is they then left and then cleaned the data and uploaded it to a website where they made it available in super high resolution for anyone to download for whatever purpose. So they released this Nefertiti bust, the other Nefertiti, as 3D data. And of course, you know, the value that's attached to the work and the desire for it, it immediately broke the internet. And even the idea of this art hack where they walked into the institution and scanned a contested object, an object that directly relates to colonization in Egypt and the German Empire, was obviously very kind of incredibly important to the dynamic and the narrative of this act. And one of the reasons that people thought that maybe there was such a reaction here also is because the museum itself sells a painted replica of the bust that it is created with its own scan and very high resolution data that's been printed and then hand painted, which is for sale for €8,900 without VAT. And so, of course, when we see that the data is made available and all of the creative remixing and the desire to kind of engage and reinterpret, we have an entire website where you can go and post what it is that you've done with it. So we have like a head that sits on top of a Lego piece. There's a Pez dispenser. I'm not sure if, you know, one of these is a shot glass, but we also have a potted plant down in the bottom. So really the artists are kind of filling the void and the desire to engage with the work that we can see through the wider community online. But it was also repurposed and digitally restored so that we have this incredibly high retextured resolution 3D model of Nefertiti online to go in and use for educational purposes. And then this wasn't just, you know, this kind of idea of like the art hack and releasing the data so that everyone could learn and reuse from this incredibly important work. They also 3D printed the work and made a video that was part of a performance about the repatriation of Nefertiti to Egypt, where she comes out of the sand, and it now sits in display at the American University in Cairo. So there is a performative aspect to this too, that obviously directly relates to the contested ownership of the work. Now, you may have also heard that there was then a scandal around whether or not the data that was released was actually and able to be created under the conditions that the artists made it. And I think this is like a really fascinating layer. And I'll explain why. But essentially, Cosmo Wenman did some kind of research into thinking, okay, could this even happen with this Kinect camera that's made by Microsoft that potentially is attached to a Raspberry Pi and a power source in a backpack, hidden under a jacket, because of course we have a no bags rule in museums as well, and started to say there is absolutely no way that what was released could have been what was made under those conditions, particularly because of the glass box that surrounds the object. And so, of course, people started to refer to it as a data hack rather than an art hack. But I also love this narrative of hoax and a heist in terms of how we're referring to what the artist potentially could have done. Because, of course, on their end, what they said was, we turned the data over to someone to clean it up and prepare it to release online. And this is what we received back. So from a legal perspective, there's a break in the chain of causation or even evidence. But at the same time, what really comes out of this and what I think is really fascinating is that only the artists know. Only the people who have control over to say whether or not this property, this object, this data in and of itself was created and obtained in the way that they say that it was, totally plays into the power imbalance and the dynamic of the institution still having control over this work. We may never know, right? Or maybe we do know, but the people who are able to kind of say what didn't happen can kind of like spin that in a way that then creates some sort of dynamic of power and narrative and control in this situation, which is exactly what the artists were doing. But one of the things that is also really interesting is Cosmo didn't let this go. He thought, okay, this really high resolution data is there. And under the Public Sector Information Directive, and of course, Freedom of Information national legislation, this data set and this file would be considered a document that's made in the performance of a public task. And so the public task of the institution. And because of that, it's subject to the Freedom of Information Act. So he filed a request with the institution for the data and ended up in a pretty, long back and forth that finally resulted in the data being released. But then when it was released to him, if you can see this in the right-hand corner, you'll see that this really high resolution scan has a copyright license, which is the CC by NC SA license, the Creative Commons license, that is stamped on the bottom. And so this relates to the exercise, but it also goes all the way back to, of course, what Doug was saying at the very beginning about the preposition that if something is in the public domain, it needs to remain in the public domain once digitized, according to Open Glam. So even Creative Commons, and there's a link to the article that Claudio Ruiz and Evelyn Scanopoulos Heidel, who presented earlier in the series, released about this topic. So I'd encourage you to go read that because it really does kind of advance some of the ideas around this and what happens when we do release data, but only for certain uses, and it can't be used according to the principles of the public domain. So this takes us into the exercise. And the exercise is this idea of a license, okay? So it may feel a bit weird to think, how do I write a license? What is it that I do? But that's actually totally up to you. So this is a bit of a conceptual exercise, but it's also something that you could potentially do and be entitled to put on your work as the terms of use, the terms and conditions according to using the data that you've created. Now, there's an interesting layer there because the data itself, of course, has to be protected by rights in order for you to be able to apply a license to it. So we can think about terms of use as actually being a bit different from the license because the license will rely on copyright law or database law or other laws that would recognize the rights in and of themselves. Or we could think about the terms and conditions of the website and how it's accessed and then downloaded. So there's some interesting dynamics there. But we thought it would be potentially really fun for you to think about drafting a license and to think about what you can do and design as a tool that will enable you to release materials in a way that kind of conform to your ideas about how you would like your materials to be used. And, that could be something according to how you think all of your creative works or the data, and if you have the rights in the data, should be used in the future. Or it may differ according to subject matter. So you might create something that seems very appropriate for public release, CC0, that sort of thing, but then something else, because of maybe the narratives that it explores or even the underlying subject matter and how you develop that, could be more appropriate for a really kind of creative license that controls what people are able to do with it later. And so we've included a bunch of examples here And I'm just going to quickly show you this one that is the anti-capitalist software license. So there's a description on the webpage, if you go and you look at it, that talks specifically about this idea of free and open source licenses, and how the anti-capitalist software license wants to kind of play into this idea of open source, but not in the sense that it will allow corporations with commerce and capitalist, it says commerce and capitalism, with capitalist purposes to use the materials that are being created. So on the left-hand side, that is actually the text of the license. And so this is an example of something that you could potentially think of when you're thinking about what a license would be and what you would want to happen to the materials, whether it's all of the materials that you create or whether it's a particular set of materials, and you think that because of that type of material, there's a specific license that's best suited for that. But it really is sort of, the text that would be on the back of a ticket, the terms and conditions that you would read when you go to look at a website, and it tells you kind of the purpose of what the restrictions are. And so on the anti-capitalist software license page, you'll see that there are a bunch of links to other licenses that have similar purposes around preventing harm or preventing exploitation, or you're not allowed to use this if you're going to contribute to climate change. And some of these things are really interesting and important to think about, especially when we think about the binary between copyright and public domain, right? So just because maybe something is not appropriate for copyright doesn't necessarily mean it's appropriate for the public domain either, because of all of these things that then can potentially happen around the materials because of the lack of copyright. And to compare this to even the CC licenses, so when you go to the Creative Commons webpage, you'll see that there's these licenses there, very, very simple statements. When you click on it, it then gives you the human readable summary. And so that's a bit more of a detailed summary, but it's not the actual licensing terms. And if you'll see, I've underlined where it says, but read the license here. And that PDF screenshot on the very right is the entire length of the license. So that's the legal code. And that's what you would be held to if you want to go and look at some of the other types of licenses that are out there. So we'll just leave it at that, because one of the things that, there can be some pros and cons about thinking about what your own license would be for the work, or whether you actually think that there are some of these really creative licenses that exist that would be more appropriate for the materials that you're creating, versus going with a more widely recognized license that is going to be legally recognized, and other people will be able to understand specifically what it pertains to because it's such a well used material. And so there may be a bit of a trade-off in what you think in terms of how you start to release your materials. So that is it for me. And I just want to go ahead and thank Doug and Mathilde again, because, kind of in the trajectory and the narrative arc of this whole series, this has been really great. And we'll open it up for questions and comments. So if anyone has anything they would like to say, please do drop it in the chat, because we'll be able to see it on our end too. And Gabby, you're very welcome to ask a question as well if you'd like to. But I wanted to respond quickly to a couple of things and the dynamic between some of these presentations. And one is that Doug has been so active recently in updating a lot of the data, that even the data that Mathilde presented is now out of date. Like sometimes this happens like a huge dump on like a weekend, and Doug's like 300, or not 300, like 32 new things added. And often there's a jurisdiction that gets added. And recently one of those was France. So we need to update that data specifically. So I did want to point that out, but also I love kind of this idea of open GLAM and open access as kind of decentralizing a lot of the knowledge and narrative development around the material culture, because people have access to the digital materials. And going back to also something that Mathilde said around these arguments about we can't restitute because people can't care for them, which is incredible. Like, let's not even go there. There's so many things wrong with it. But there, was a Clubhouse actually a couple weeks ago, or maybe a week ago, where MC Hammer used his platform and invited Dan Hicks, who recently has published The Brutish Museums, that goes into detail specifically about the Benin bronzes and the massacre that occurred in order to take the materials out of the Benin Kingdom. And someone brought this point up, and I loved the way that MC Hammer kind of formulated it, where he said, if these people had the intellect to make these beautiful works and, to care for them and even conceive of the care that's intended around them, then I'm pretty sure like when we return them, they're actually going to a better place than the, sterile environment and the way that they're kind of being treated and almost ossified and prevented from the purpose for which they were created and made, which, is anyway. So I'll leave it at that. But yeah. So let me go ahead and maybe ask both Mathilde and Doug to kind of touch on something that you both brought up, which is about this dynamic of the metrics for Open Glam and the questions around digitization and why digitization seems to be a value that often is related to resources, often is related to access to technology, and even when we think about resolution and technology devices and how people are accessing digital collections, why that can materialize differently in parts of the world that maybe have data aggregators and I guess this is where I'm going, these like incredibly developed networks because of kind of the values and the understandings around even copyright specifically and the type of culture that's created that is appropriate for copyright or public domain. So I would ask both Doug and Mathilde if maybe that wasn't necessarily a direct question, but something that I recognized as a connection between your two presentations that was really interesting and really unique, which you both kind of explored and expanded on, and ask you if you'd like to add to any of that, because it's, of course, part of the theme of what we're discussing.
Yeah, I would be happy to start if that's okay. Yeah, it's a great point. The way that I always try and think and try and present the open access landscape or the open Glam world is that it's incredibly uneven in so many ways. If it was a video game, it would be like you'd be walking over a mountain 1 second and in the next moment you'd be in a desert. Like it really is very uneven. It's full of peaks and troughs. I mean, I think Mathilde and I mentioned image quality. That's massively variable. Yesterday I downloaded a file from the National Palace Museum in Taiwan. Great collection, open access. Check it out. It was a 16 gigabyte TIFF file. It wasn't a JPEG. I thought, wow, okay, this is why it's taking so long. It's not that my Wi-Fi is broken. And then, yeah, another extreme, and there are actually even worse examples, but the National Gallery, the Finney that I had up in my slides, I have to fill out a form. I need to read their terms for the NCND license just to get an 800 pixel JPEG. I mean, really, what is that useful for? Okay, it's probably okay for a blog, maybe a small illustration in a published print book, but not a lot else. It's certainly not serving, if you take the kind of mission perspective of what GLAMs really are for, and often what we publicly fund them to do. Does it enable me to really understand, look at in detail, maybe for research purposes, maybe if I'm an educator or I'm using it as a teaching resource? I want to crop into that fuzzy, cute little dog or whatever the intriguing mirror in between them. I can't do anything with that, what the gallery is providing me. And that page, by the way, has looked like that for years. So I only want to sort of reinforce that huge unevenness in the landscape. That's just one example, and also relates to the way that copyright in terms of use are expressed. A couple of days ago, I was on a national gallery in, I won't name them for being polite, but in, let's say, sort of Central Europe. And they had an open access policy, CC BY, I think it was, for a painting. Okay, great. When I tried to download it, it then said that I needed to, if I published it anywhere, send them a copy of the book as well. It's like, okay, that's quite old school. That's the kind of thing that I had expected in the early 2000s, when I used to manage licensing for a national museum, it's the kind of thing museums would do. So this is what I mean about the power of the status quo. There's a massive amount of inertia in the Glam space where people really do not want to lose control, and that policy and practices can be very slow to evolve. So I want to hand over to Mathilde now. Thank you.
Yeah, and I'm just going to respond to something that you've said. Even high res, right? So we're thinking digitization is positive, open access is positive. There's really rich, heavy file that you can do a lot with, completely inaccessible if you're in a low Wi-Fi, no digital tech facilities part of the world. And I don't want to stereotype, but outside Europe and or the global north, that happens regularly. And you even mentioned, Douglas, the speed of download, and I presume you're somewhere fairly well connected and you have access to pretty decent tech to get to access and engage with that. So even when we're doing all of the good stuff, right, stuff, high quality according to on our terms, actually there are massive sort of asymmetries in other parts, and that could be like not at all practical. And sometimes when you liaise with certain parts of the world or users across the world, you're asked to have actually low res everything and be mindful of that, otherwise your stuff just is not accessible and can't be engaged. So digital is great, high quality digital is great, comes with digital barriers on the ground and in practice that open access alone can't resolve, but perhaps could be thought about in the context of digitization. And yeah, so I mean, I'm kind of riffing off your comments here, Doug, so I don't know how coherent that is. And I kind of forgot the starting point of this thread of thought from Andrea. I remember that, or some of it. Because for me, you talked about the asymmetries and the differences in the digital. And I think for me, my starting point is that it was never obvious. So going from the point of the world or the peoples, even to say of performance and intangible cultural heritage, digitizing doesn't make sense often and is not something that's obvious, that's necessarily beneficial. It's seen as often negative or reifying or creating layers of control and ownership that you don't want. And that's why you're keeping it intangible, and that's why it formed in that kind of essence in the first place. And there's kind of this, so it can be useful in certain regards if done well and if done, in a sort of collaborative way and all of that. So I don't want to say that digitization is a big no-no and is negative and can't be done well. Same with open access, same with closed access or nuanced access. But it was interesting to me to move to like the 2D world when everything digital. Yeah, let's go. Well, actually, there's a lot of things even in your life that you don't want to digitize and you don't want to have open access, like photos of yourself. You don't always necessarily want to stick it up and have it for everybody to engage with. And that's kind of how I relate with cultural objects belonging to different communities, I suppose. I see it. Do I want a picture of myself or my child or my little sister, always available, usable at any point in time? Maybe not. Would I want that for paintings and other forms of cultural collections? Absolutely. But I feel I have more sort of a closeness to it that can make those decisions in relation to certain objects, but not all. So I don't know. I don't know if that's answering your brief, Andrea.
Yeah, no, that was great. And ties it back to that digitization, or at least how we go about digitizing things currently, is such a specific approach that often reduces the culture to a specific view, which is that accurate, scientific, this is an exact reproduction sort of thing. That can be actually a bit of an obstruction when we're thinking about the underlying work in the object, and how we learn from it. I think there's also an interesting dynamic that seems to be kind of underlying a lot of discussions at the moment that I also would like both of you to talk about, which is that digitization can enable repatriation because you send the digital files back to the countries of origin so that they're able to use them. And so I wonder if you could both speak to maybe some of that discussion as it even being a substitution for repatriation of the material work.
So I can jump on Doug and then maybe you can follow up. So on that, I want to say yes and no. I'm sensing the irony in your voice. So you're saying the digital as a substitute for the material? No, absolutely not. That it's like, it's an insult. I mean, come on. Especially if you're looking to repatriate to communities that do not have the digital or the tech to be engaging with the work. Like that wouldn't make sense, especially when they've been so disengaged and cut off from the work that they don't even know why they would engage with a poor res digital reproduction of an object their communities hasn't been around for decades, centuries, depending on the situation. It's a terrible idea. But where it starts becoming something to think about, or a temporary strategy, is for objects where the home institutions wants to restitute but is stuck in local national laws that says you cannot de-access from your national archives because the law kind of prohibits you, or there are other things that are tying the object to the ground, despite the fact that actually curators, institutions, stakeholders on site is like, let's do this, let's repatriate. One thing you can think about is start with the digital. It's not in replacement of, it's waiting, kind of pending. As soon as we get moving on other aspects or holding us back, we're making a commitment and we're starting there. Or at least we're starting to share the curatorial decisions with you, and that includes digitalization, and open access, or whatever access policy you have around the object. Then maybe it's a bit more flexible and we're starting to open the door, and then maybe that can be used as a way to change mindsets for the policymakers that are a little bit stuck on those conversations in some respect, and be like, look, we give the digital away, nothing happened, let's move on with the material now. I don't know. That's how potentially I could see it, but otherwise, no. If it's instead of, it's an insult, let's not go there. Like, no.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that. And just to add a very small kind of cherry on top, I'd say that a case-by-case approach and very, I'd say, mindful digitization and sort of community dialogue practice is really the way to go, because the universals that often are kind of bandied around to do with policy and practice, I mean, yes, they're helpful to a certain extent. They give a framework which can be applicable and maybe remixable to what the specific thing that you want to do with the communities and the objects that you're dealing with. But I always am, as Andrea knows, I think I'm a big champion of localism, and I think that anything in these policy areas to do with how intellectual property is handled, what's the role of digital in these kind of transactions, discussions, really needs to be done in kind of open and transparent dialogue with the relevant communities involved. It's really not something that is a kind of cookie cutter approach. So that would be that's my cherry. Thank you.
If I could just add one small anecdote to that, I was particularly pleased by your example from your case study, Andrea, because the Nefertiti model, just in the time in between it being this art hack and the official text being released, in the Institute for Classical Studies, I was we were being visited that year by an Egyptian colleague, Osama Gad, who I'm sure he won't mind me telling this anecdote. And we were also playing around with our 3D printer. So I actually have, I can get it on camera, Nefertiti on my bookshelf at the moment. So I was able to go and grab it while you were talking. This is a fairly low resolution scan. It's obviously a lot smaller than the original, a low resolution print, I mean, but nevertheless, it was quite nice to play around with this in this way, and we were able to print it in different colours. But on your subject, on your point, and Mathilde's point about in a world in which the museum is not going to send the Nefertiti bust back to Egypt anytime soon. My colleague Osama and I were playing around with these 3D prints, and he was so delighted by this this piece of his national cultural heritage that he made me print 4 more of these. And these, I should point out, this takes 13 hours to print, even this fairly small, not very high resolution thing. So he made me print 4 more of these in different colors for him to take home as presents for his wife and daughters. So they have the Nefertiti Hack back in Egypt, or not currently in Egypt, but when they go back to Egypt. It is still something that is valued and that is people are pleased about.
Yeah, and I would agree with you, Gabby, especially thinking about sorry, my neighbor's cat just comes. This has happened. I'm totally thrown off. The fact that yes, sorry. The digital materials, sometimes during this, there's been examples where the digital materials go back, and then actually the copyright goes with the digital materials and further restricts the community of origin. I think this is also something that there are a lot of examples of where, okay, these are wonderful high resolution digital images, but FYI, they're copyright us. But here you go, you can have them and you can use them and you can use them for your purposes, but just keep in mind that like they can't be made available as well, which is another extension of the control around that. So the open data, the open status then becomes really important. Especially when we start to think about it being integrated into spaces like Wikimedia Commons and Wikipedia for being able to write and produce knowledge in the country and the language of origin, and to be able to direct those narratives too. So I will say thank you very much, because it looks like we've come to the conclusion of this. To both Doug and Mathilde and Nefertiti for joining us today. And good luck with your exercise on the license. I would say that you should like have fun with it and be creative, because I think thinking about that a bit differently and about some of the harms that are important, even to you personally, and thinking about what could be prevented can help you kind of find the nuance around some of that in a really creative way. So thank you very much for coming today, and yeah, I'll hand it back to Gabby.
Thank you. That was great.